the mist rolls across the North Sea, carrying with it the echoes of oaken longships, cutting through dark waters toward unknown shores. Tonight, we embark on a journey that spans over 1,000 years, following a people whose very name would become synonymous with England itself. This is the story of the Saxons, a tale that begins in the dense forests and wind-swept coastlands of what we now call Germany and Denmark, and unfolds into one of the most remarkable migrations and conquests in human history. But before we dive into the depths of Saxon chronicles and archaeological discoveries, let me paint you a picture of why this story matters so profoundly. The Saxons weren't just another Germanic tribe wandering across Europe's chaotic landscape during the twilight of Roman power. They were the architects of a civilization that would fundamentally reshape the British Isles, laying the groundwork for the English language you're hearing right now, the legal systems that govern millions today, and the cultural traditions that echo through centuries. What makes this narrative particularly fascinating is how the Saxons transform from seafaring raiders and farmers into the builders of kingdoms that would eventually unite under one crown. Their story weaves together threads of mythology and hard archaeological evidence, of heroic poetry and brutal warfare, of pagan rituals and Christian conversion, creating a tapestry so rich and complex that historians are still discovering new patterns within it. The Saxon story challenges everything we think we know about the so-called Dark Ages. Far from being a period of ignorance and barbarism, the Saxon era reveals itself as a time of remarkable innovation, artistic achievement, and political sophistication. These weren't savage raiders stumbling blindly through history, but skilled craftsmen, clever diplomats, and visionary leaders who built a civilization that would endure for centuries and influence the world far beyond their island home. Our journey begins in the 4th century, when the mighty Roman Empire still cast its shadow across Europe, but cracks were beginning to show in its seemingly eternal facade. In the forests of Saxony, along the rivers of Holstein, and across the Danish peninsula, communities of Germanic peoples were stirring with new ambitions and facing new pressures that would soon drive them across the sea to Britain's shores. The earliest Saxon settlements emerged from a world in flux. While Roman legions maintained their grip on Gaul and Britain, beyond the empire's carefully guarded frontiers lived peoples whose names would echo through history: Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians. These weren't unified nations in any modern sense, but rather collections of tribes, clans, and warrior bands bound together by shared languages, customs, and the eternal human desire for better lands and greater opportunities. Archaeological evidence from the Saxon homeland reveals communities of remarkable sophistication. Excavations at sites like Feddersen have uncovered large farmsteads with carefully planned layouts, advanced agricultural techniques, and evidence of skilled metalworking and pottery production. These weren't primitive villages, but thriving agricultural communities that supported specialized craftsmen and maintained extensive trade networks reaching across northern Europe. The Saxon social structure was built around the fundamental unit of the household, or what they called the ham. Each household typically included not just immediate family members, but also servants, slaves, and retainers bound to the household head by complex webs of loyalty and obligation. Above these households stood the local chieftains or ealdormen, whose authority derived from their ability to protect their followers, distribute wealth, and lead successful raids against neighbouring communities. But what truly set Saxon society apart was its emphasis on personal reputation and honour. A warrior's worth wasn't measured simply by his wealth or birth, but by his deeds in battle, his loyalty to his lord, and his generosity to his followers. This created a dynamic, competitive society where social mobility was possible through military service and where the bonds between lord and retainer were considered sacred. The Saxon warrior culture centered around the concept of the comitatus, the warband of young men who pledged their lives to serve a prominent leader. These weren't mere mercenaries, but sworn companions who shared in both the dangers and rewards of their leaders' enterprises. The bond between lord and retainer was so strong that it was considered the ultimate shame for a warrior to survive his lord's death in battle. This warrior ethos produced some of the most sophisticated metalworking in early medieval Europe. Saxon smiths created weapons that were not merely tools of war, but works of art that embodied the owner's status and spiritual beliefs. Pattern-welded swords, with their distinctive serpentine designs, weren't just effective weapons, but symbols of prestige that might be passed down through generations or buried with their owners as companions for the afterlife. The spiritual world of the early Saxons was populated by a pantheon of gods, whose names still echo in our days of the week. Woden, the one-eyed wanderer and master of wisdom and war, ruled over a cosmos where gods and mortals alike were bound by the inexorable threads of fate. Thuna, the thunder wielder, protected communities from the chaotic forces of giants and monsters. Frigg, the goddess of love and fertility, watched over households and ensured the continuation of bloodlines. Saxon religion wasn't a matter of passive worship, but active participation in a cosmic drama where gods and mortals struggled together against the forces of chaos and destruction. Religious festivals marked the turning of the seasons and the critical moments in the agricultural cycle, while elaborate burial rituals ensured that the dead would find their proper place in the other world. The most dramatic expressions of Saxon religious belief can be found in their ship burials, where prominent individuals were interred in their vessels along with weapons, jewelry, and household goods needed for the journey to the next world. The famous ship burial at Sutton Hoo, though dating from after the migration to Britain, represents the culmination of traditions that began in the Saxon homeland centuries earlier. As the 4th century progressed, pressure began building on Saxon communities from multiple directions. Climate change was making agriculture more difficult across northern Europe, while population growth strained available resources. More ominously, the movement of other Germanic peoples, particularly the Huns under Attila, was creating a domino effect that displaced entire populations and sent them searching for new homes. The Roman Empire's increasing reliance on Germanic federates and mercenaries created opportunities for ambitious Saxon leaders to gain military experience and wealth through service to Roman commanders. These early contacts with Roman civilization exposed Saxon elites to new ideas about warfare, government, and urban life that would prove crucial in their later conquest of Britain. Perhaps most importantly, Saxon raiders had been probing British coastal defences for decades, learning about the island's geography, wealth, and military weaknesses. These reconnaissance missions revealed a land of extraordinary fertility and prosperity, protected by an increasingly unreliable military force that relied heavily on mercenary troops who might be persuaded to change sides under the right circumstances. The Saxon migration to Britain wasn't a single dramatic invasion, but rather a complex process that unfolded over several generations. It began with small-scale raiding expeditions that tested British defences and identified promising targets. Successful raiders returned home with tales of rich monasteries, fertile farmland, and weakly defended settlements that could be taken by determined warriors willing to risk the dangerous sea crossing. Some Saxons came to Britain as invited guests, hired by Romano-British leaders who needed experienced warriors to defend against other barbarian raids or to settle scores with local rivals. These mercenary bands often established permanent settlements in the areas they were supposed to protect, gradually transforming from defenders into conquerors as they attracted reinforcements from their homeland and intermarried with local populations. The collapse of effective Roman administration in Britain during the early 5th century created a power vacuum that Saxon warbands were ideally positioned to fill. Their military organisation, based on personal loyalty and shared risk, proved more flexible and resilient than the bureaucratic structures left behind by the Romans. While Romano-British leaders struggled to maintain control over fragmenting territories, Saxon chieftains were building new power bases that would eventually coalesce into the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. The archaeological record from early Saxon settlements in Britain reveals communities that maintained strong connections with their continental homeland while adapting to their new environment. Pottery styles, burial practices, and settlement patterns all show clear continuity with Saxon traditions, but also demonstrate rapid innovation as the immigrants learn to exploit British resources and opportunities. What emerges from this evidence is a picture of the Saxon settlement, not as a violent conquest that swept away all traces of Romano-British civilization, but as a gradual transformation that blended Germanic and British elements into something entirely new. The Saxons brought their language, laws, and customs to Britain, but they also adopted local practices and incorporated British populations into their expanding communities. The success of Saxon settlement in Britain depended on their ability to establish effective relationships with existing populations. While conflict certainly occurred, the archaeological evidence suggests that accommodation and intermarriage were probably more common than wholesale displacement. Saxon leaders needed the knowledge and skills of British farmers, craftsmen, and traders to make their new territories productive and prosperous. This process of cultural synthesis created the foundation for what would eventually become Anglo-Saxon civilization. The Saxon kingdoms that emerged in Britain during the 6th and 7th centuries weren't simply transplanted Germanic communities, but hybrid societies that combined the best elements of both traditions. Their success in establishing stable, prosperous kingdoms would depend on their ability to maintain this delicate balance between tradition and innovation. As we follow the Saxon story through the coming centuries, we'll witness the transformation of these migrant communities into the founders of some of medieval Europe's most powerful kingdoms. We'll see how Saxon warriors became Saxon kings, how pagan raiders became Christian scholars, and how a collection of rival tribes became the unified English nation. The journey ahead promises battles and betrayals, saints and scholars, magnificent treasures and devastating defeats, all woven together into the epic tapestry of Saxon history. The transformation of Saxon society during the 5th and 6th centuries represents one of history's most remarkable cultural metamorphoses. As Saxon communities established themselves across the fertile landscapes of Britain, they encountered challenges that would forge them into something entirely unprecedented in Germanic history. The island's Roman legacy presented both opportunities and obstacles that would fundamentally reshape Saxon identity and ambition. The early Saxon settlers discovered a landscape scarred by decades of civil war and administrative collapse, yet still bearing the impressive infrastructure of Roman civilization. Abandoned villas dotted the countryside, their hypercoursed heating systems and mosaic floors testament to a level of sophistication that even impressed the pragmatic Germanic newcomers. Roman roads stretched across the island like a vast network of stone arteries, connecting settlements and providing rapid communication routes that Saxon leaders quickly learned to exploit for their own purposes. More intriguing still were the urban centres that the Romans had established throughout Britain. Cities like Londinium, Verulamium, and Eboracum stood as monuments to imperial ambition, their massive walls and public buildings representing organisational capabilities that dwarfed anything the Saxons had known in their homeland. Yet these urban centres were largely abandoned by the time significant Saxon settlement began, their populations having fled or died during the chaos that followed Roman withdrawal. The Saxon response to these urban ruins reveals much about their practical nature and adaptive intelligence. Rather than attempting to maintain the complex infrastructure required for city life, most Saxon communities established their settlements in the countryside, choosing locations that offered good agricultural land, access to water, and natural defensive advantages. They weren't anti-urban by nature, but they recognized that their social and economic systems were better suited to rural environments where extended kinship networks could function effectively. This preference for rural settlement created a distinctive pattern of Saxon occupation that would characterize Anglo-Saxon England for centuries. Instead of concentrated urban populations, Saxon Britain developed as a patchwork of small farming communities, each centred around a lord's hall and supporting a mixed population of free farmers, craftsmen, and servants. These communities were largely self-sufficient, producing their own food, clothing, tools, and weapons, while maintaining networks of trade and alliance that connected them to neighbouring settlements. The Saxon Hall, or Mead Hall, as it's often called in later poetry, became the focal point of community life and the physical embodiment of Saxon social values. These weren't simply large houses, but carefully constructed symbols of lordly power and communal identity. The hall served as residence for the lord and his household, meeting place for important decisions, venue for religious ceremonies, and centre for the elaborate feasts that reinforced social bonds and distributed wealth throughout the community. Archaeological excavations at sites like Yeavering in Northumberland have revealed the impressive scale and sophistication of Saxon royal halls. The Great Hall at Yeavering measured over 30 metres in length and featured elaborate wooden carvings, imported glass vessels, and evidence of metalworking activities that produced jewellery and weapons of extraordinary quality. The complex also included smaller buildings for specific functions, animal enclosures, and even what appears to have been an amphitheatre-like structure for public assemblies. The social dynamics within these hall-centred communities reflected the complex interplay between Germanic traditions and the realities of life in post-Roman Britain. Saxon society remained fundamentally hierarchical, with clear distinctions between lords, free farmers, and slaves. But the disruption of migration and settlement had created opportunities for social mobility that hadn't existed in the homeland. Successful warriors could earn land grants and establish their own halls, while skilled craftsmen might accumulate wealth that elevated their status within the community. The institution of slavery played a crucial role in Saxon economic life, providing the labour force necessary for agricultural production and craft manufacture. Saxon law codes reveal a complex system of slave ownership and management that protected slaves from arbitrary treatment while ensuring their productive contribution to the community. Slaves could earn their freedom through exceptional service, purchase their liberty with accumulated wealth, or be freed by generous masters as acts of religious devotion. Women in Saxon society occupied positions of considerable influence, particularly within the domestic sphere where they managed household resources, supervised craft production, and often controlled significant wealth. Noble women might inherit land, participate in political negotiations, and even rule kingdoms in their own right under exceptional circumstances. The archaeological record provides evidence of wealthy female burials with grave goods, including weapons, jewellery, and symbols of authority that suggest women's active participation in the power structures of Saxon society. The economic foundations of Saxon communities rested primarily on agriculture, but the prosperity of many settlements depended on their ability to exploit specialised resources and maintain profitable trade relationships. Coastal communities developed fishing industries and participated in cross-channel trade with continental partners. Settlements near mineral deposits became centres for metalworking and weapon production. Communities with access to good clay developed pottery industries that supplied neighbouring regions. The most prestigious craft specialisation involved the production of fine metalwork, particularly weapons and jewellery that served both practical and symbolic functions. Saxon smiths developed techniques for working gold, silver, bronze, and iron that produced objects of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication. The intricate animal ornament that decorated Saxon brooches, sword hilts, and belt buckles represented a distinctive artistic tradition that blended Germanic, Roman, and Celtic influences into something uniquely Anglo-Saxon. Religious life in early Saxon communities centred around the worship of Germanic deities, whose favour was essential for agricultural success, military victory, and protection from supernatural dangers. Sacred groves, springs, and hilltops served as centres for community rituals that marked the seasonal cycle and reinforced social bonds. Religious festivals provided occasions for feasting, gift-giving, and the renewal of oaths that held Saxon society together. The arrival of Christian missionaries in the late 6th century would eventually transform Saxon religious practice, but the conversion process was gradual and complex, with pagan and Christian elements coexisting for generations. Saxon kings often maintained relationships with both Christian bishops and pagan priests, hedging their spiritual bets while navigating the political advantages that different religious affiliations might provide. The political organization of Saxon Britain evolved through a process of conquest, alliance, and consolidation that gradually created the kingdoms we know from later historical sources. The earliest Saxon settlements were probably organized around individual war bands led by successful military leaders who established control over specific territories through a combination of force and negotiation. These local strongmen faced constant challenges from rival Saxon groups, surviving British kingdoms, and external threats that required military readiness and diplomatic skill. Successful Saxon leaders expanded their territories by absorbing weaker neighbours, forming marriage alliances with neighbouring rulers, and attracting followers through generous distribution of wealth and land. The most successful eventually proclaimed themselves kings and established dynasties that would rule their territories for centuries. The emergence of kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria represented the consolidation of Saxon power and the beginning of the political structures that would eventually unite to form England. The process of kingdom formation was neither smooth nor inevitable. Saxon Britain remained politically fragmented for centuries, with numerous rival kingdoms competing for dominance through warfare, diplomacy, and marriage alliances. The balance of power shifted constantly as kingdoms rose and fell, absorbed their neighbours or were absorbed in turn, and adapted to changing military, economic, and religious circumstances that shaped their development. The emergence of Saxon kingdoms represented far more than simple territorial expansion. It marked the birth of political institutions that would fundamentally reshape the governance of Britain. These weren't crude military dictatorships imposed by conquering warlords, but sophisticated administrative systems that balanced the competing demands of warrior culture, agricultural productivity, and the complex realities of ruling diverse populations across varied landscapes. The development of Saxon kingship drew heavily on Germanic traditions while adapting to the unique circumstances of post-Roman Britain. Saxon kings weren't absolute monarchs in the later medieval sense, but rather the most prominent members of a warrior aristocracy whose authority depended on their ability to provide protection, distribute wealth, and maintain the favour of both gods and men. The King's Hall served as the centre of government, where important decisions were made through consultation with noble advisors and where the rituals of kingship reinforced the sacred nature of royal authority. The concept of royal legitimacy among the Saxons involved a complex interplay between military prowess, noble birth, and divine favour. Most Saxon dynasties trace their ancestry back to the gods themselves, with Woden appearing as the ultimate ancestor in numerous royal genealogies. This divine connection wasn't merely ceremonial propaganda, but reflected genuine beliefs about the supernatural sources of royal power and the king's role as intermediary between the human and divine realms. The practical exercise of Saxon kingship required constant attention to the delicate balance between competing factions within the kingdom. Noble families who had established their own power bases during the settlement period expected consultation on important matters and rewards for their continued loyalty. Free farmers, who formed the backbone of the kingdom's military force, demanded protection from raiders and fair treatment in legal disputes. Craftsmen and traders needed stable conditions for their economic activities, while the growing Christian church sought royal patronage and protection for its expanding influence. Saxon law codes, beginning with those attributed to King Ethelbert of Kent in the early 7th century, reveal sophisticated legal thinking that attempted to balance Germanic customary law with the practical needs of governing settled agricultural communities. These codes weren't comprehensive legal systems in the modern sense, but rather collections of precedents and penalties that guided royal judgment in specific types of disputes. The emphasis on compensation rather than punishment reflected Saxon values that prioritized community harmony over abstract notions of justice. The Vergild system, which assigned specific monetary values to individuals based on their social status, provided a framework for resolving conflicts that might otherwise have led to blood feuds and social disruption. A noble's life was valued more highly than a commoner's, but even slaves had recognized worth that protected them from arbitrary violence. This system acknowledged social hierarchy while providing mechanisms for peaceful dispute resolution that strengthened royal authority and promoted social stability. The military organization of Saxon kingdoms evolved from the warband structure of the migration period into more complex systems capable of defending extensive territories and conducting large-scale campaigns. The Fyrd, or general levy, required all free men to provide military service when called upon by their king, while professional warriors maintained by royal and noble households provided the core strength for sustained military operations. This dual system allowed Saxon kingdoms to mobilize large numbers of troops when necessary, while maintaining smaller forces for routine security needs. Saxon warfare combined traditional Germanic tactics with innovations adapted from contact with Roman military practices and the specific challenges of fighting in British terrain. The shield wall remained the basic infantry formation, with warriors standing shoulder to shoulder behind interlocked shields while thrusting with spears and striking with swords at enemy formations. Cavalry played a limited role in early Saxon warfare, but mounted warriors became increasingly important for reconnaissance, pursuit, and raids that required rapid movement across difficult terrain. The fortification of Saxon kingdoms involved both the construction of new defensive works and the adaptation of existing Roman and British structures. Hill forts provided refuge for local populations during enemy raids, while royal burhs served as administrative centres and military strongholds that projected royal power throughout the kingdom. The most ambitious defensive projects involved the construction of linear earthworks like Offa's Dyke, which marked the boundary between Saxon Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms, while demonstrating the organisational capabilities of mature Saxon kingdoms. Trade and commerce flourished under Saxon rule as political stability and royal protection created conditions favourable for economic development. Markets established at royal centres and important river crossings became focal points for regional exchange networks that connected Saxon kingdoms with continental Europe and the wider world. Archaeological evidence from trading sites like Hamwick and Ipswich reveals the importation of luxury goods, including silk, spices, and precious metals that indicate the wealth and sophisticated tastes of Saxon elites. The development of Saxon coinage marked a crucial step in the evolution of royal authority and economic sophistication. Early Saxon coins, often modelled on Byzantine and Frankish prototypes, served primarily as prestige objects and diplomatic gifts, rather than everyday currency. As Saxon kingdoms matured, however, royal mints began producing standardized coins that facilitated trade while proclaiming royal authority through carefully chosen symbols and inscriptions. The artistic achievements of Saxon craftsmen reached extraordinary heights during the 7th and 8th centuries, producing works that combined technical excellence with distinctive aesthetic sensibilities. The great treasures discovered at Sutton Hoo represent the pinnacle of Saxon goldsmithing, with intricate cloisonné garnet work and sophisticated metalworking techniques that rivaled the finest contemporary work from anywhere in Europe. These weren't merely displays of wealth, but sophisticated expressions of Saxon cultural values and artistic vision. The famous Sutton Hoo helmet, with its bronze and iron construction decorated with intricate scenes of warriors and mythological creatures, exemplifies the Saxon fusion of practical functionality with symbolic meaning. The helmet wasn't just protective equipment, but a carefully crafted representation of royal power that connected its wearer to both earthly military might and supernatural divine protection. Similar artistic sensibilities can be seen in Saxon jewellery, weapons, and decorative objects that transformed functional items into works of art. The tradition of Saxon poetry that found its ultimate expression in works like Beowulf had its roots in the oral culture of the migration period, but flourished under the patronage of Christian Saxon kingdoms that valued both entertainment and the preservation of cultural memory. The scop, or court poet, played a crucial role in Saxon society, not merely as an entertainer, but as a keeper of genealogies, a recorder of great deeds, and a creator of the cultural narratives that gave meaning to Saxon identity. The heroic ethos celebrated in Saxon poetry reflected values that remained central to Saxon culture, even as political and religious circumstances changed. The ideal warrior remained the man who stood by his lord in battle, shared freely with his companions, and sought fame through brave deeds that would be remembered long after his death. These values provided continuity between the pagan warrior culture of the migration period and the Christian kingdoms that emerged during the conversion era. The conversion of the Saxon kingdoms to Christianity represented one of the most significant cultural transformations in British history, but the process was neither uniform nor complete. The mission of Augustine to Kent in 597 marked the beginning of systematic Christian evangelization, but the ultimate success of Christianity depended on its ability to accommodate Saxon cultural values and social structures rather than simply replacing them with foreign alternatives. Saxon kings who accepted Christianity did so for complex reasons that included genuine religious conviction, political advantage, and cultural prestige. Christian kingship offered new models of royal authority that could complement traditional Germanic concepts of divine favor, while connections to the wider Christian world provided opportunities for diplomatic alliance and cultural exchange that strengthened Saxon kingdoms against their rivals. The synthesis of Christian and Saxon traditions produced distinctive forms of religious expression that reflected the particular circumstances of Anglo-Saxon society. Saxon churches combined Roman architectural elements with Germanic decorative traditions, creating buildings that served both practical liturgical needs and symbolic functions as monuments to royal piety and power. The development of distinctively Anglo-Saxon forms of monasticism provided new outlets for religious devotion, while creating institutions that would play crucial roles in education, scholarship, and economic development. The intellectual achievements of Saxon scholars during the 8th century established Anglo-Saxon England as one of the leading centres of learning in medieval Europe. Figures like Bede, Alcuin, and Aldhelm produced works of theology, history, and poetry that influenced intellectual development throughout the Christian world. The libraries and scriptoriums of Saxon monasteries preserved not only Christian texts, but also classical works that might otherwise have been lost during the political upheavals of the early medieval period. The educational system that developed in Saxon monasteries created the literate class that would staff royal administrations and provide the intellectual foundation for the more sophisticated governmental systems that emerged during the later Saxon period. The combination of classical learning, Christian theology, and Germanic cultural traditions produced a distinctive Anglo-Saxon intellectual culture that made significant contributions to medieval European thought. As the 8th century progressed, the Saxon kingdoms faced new challenges that would test their military capabilities, political institutions, and cultural resilience. The appearance of Viking raiders along the coasts of Britain marked the beginning of a new phase in Saxon history, one that would see their hard-won achievements threatened by warriors whose mobility and ruthlessness echoed their own ancestors' conquest of Britain centuries earlier. The Viking raids that began in earnest during the 790s represented more than simple piracy. They marked the beginning of a sustained assault on Saxon civilization by peoples whose military organization and cultural values closely resembled those of the early Saxon migrants. The Vikings brought with them not only immediate military threats, but also long-term challenges to Saxon political unity and cultural identity that would reshape the development of English civilization. The Saxon response to the Viking challenge would demonstrate both the strengths and weaknesses of the political system they had created in Britain. The fragmented nature of Saxon authority, which had allowed for cultural diversity and local autonomy, proved vulnerable to coordinated attacks by enemies who could exploit divisions between rival kingdoms. Yet the same warrior culture that had enabled Saxon conquest would provide the foundation for resistance and eventual recovery. The monastery bells of Lindisfarne had scarcely finished echoing across the Northumbrian coast when the dragon-prowed ships appeared on the horizon that fateful morning in 793. The monks, accustomed to peaceful contemplation and scholarly pursuits, could hardly comprehend the sight of these sleek vessels cutting through the morning mist with predatory precision. Within hours, the sacred island that had nurtured Christian learning for generations lay in smoking ruins, its treasures plundered, its monks slaughtered or carried away as slaves. This devastating raid marked not merely another episode of maritime piracy, but the opening salvo in what would become a centuries-long struggle that would fundamentally reshape the character of Saxon England. The Vikings who descended upon British shores brought with them a military efficiency and cultural ruthlessness that would force the Saxon kingdoms to adapt or perish. Their arrival shattered the relative stability that had allowed Saxon civilization to flourish during the 8th century, replacing it with an age of constant warfare and political uncertainty. The Viking raiders possessed several crucial advantages over their Saxon opponents that made them formidable enemies despite their relatively small numbers. Their shallow drafted longships could navigate rivers and coastal waters with ease, allowing them to strike deep into Saxon territory before defenders could organize effective resistance. The Vikings' mobility meant they could concentrate their forces at vulnerable points while avoiding the heavily fortified positions where Saxon armies might have advantages in pitched battle. More fundamentally, the Vikings retained the pure warrior culture that the Saxons had gradually modified through centuries of settlement and Christianization. While Saxon society had developed complex agricultural and administrative systems that required protection, Viking raiders remained unencumbered by territorial responsibilities that might limit their strategic options. They could retreat to their ships when faced with superior forces, sail to new targets when local defenses proved too strong, or simply return home with their plunder when the raiding season ended. The psychological impact of Viking raids extended far beyond their immediate military consequences. Saxon communities that had grown accustomed to relative security suddenly found themselves vulnerable to attacks that could materialize without warning from sea or river. The Vikings' reputation for ruthless efficiency in battle and their apparent contempt for Christian sanctity created terror that often proved more effective than their actual military capabilities. The response of Saxon kingdoms to the Viking threat revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their political systems. Individual kingdoms like Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia possessed sufficient military resources to defeat Viking forces in direct confrontation, but their mutual rivalries prevented the coordinated response that might have eliminated the Viking threat before it could establish permanent footholds in Britain. The fragmentation of Saxon political authority that had allowed for cultural diversity and local autonomy now became a strategic liability. Viking leaders could exploit divisions between Saxon kingdoms, forming temporary alliances with one ruler against his rivals, or simply shifting their attacks to regions where resistance appeared weakest. The lack of unified command meant that Saxon victories in one area couldn't prevent Viking successes elsewhere, allowing the raiders to maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. King Alfred of Wessex emerged as the most effective Saxon leader during this period of crisis, developing innovative military and administrative strategies that would prove crucial for Saxon survival. Alfred's reforms went far beyond simple military improvements, encompassing educational initiatives, legal codification, and administrative reorganization that strengthened Saxon society's ability to resist external pressure while maintaining internal cohesion. The military innovations introduced by Alfred and his successors transformed Saxon warfare from the relatively static shield wall tactics that had dominated earlier conflicts to more flexible systems capable of responding to Viking mobility and tactical innovation. The construction of fortified burhs throughout Wessex created a network of defensive positions that could provide refuge for local populations while serving as bases for counterattacks against Viking forces. Alfred's naval programme represented perhaps his most far-sighted innovation, recognising that effective defence against seaborne raiders required the development of Saxon maritime capabilities that could challenge Viking control of coastal waters. The construction of larger warships, designed specifically for combat rather than transport, marked the beginning of English naval development that would eventually establish British maritime dominance centuries later. The educational and cultural programmes initiated during Alfred's reign addressed deeper vulnerabilities in Saxon society that went beyond immediate military concerns. The King's translation projects, which rendered important Latin works into Anglo-Saxon vernacular, aimed to preserve and disseminate knowledge that might otherwise be lost during periods of political upheaval. These efforts reflected Alfred's understanding that long-term Saxon survival required not merely military success, but cultural resilience that could withstand external pressure. The legal reforms implemented during this period codified Saxon customary law, while incorporating Christian principles and practical innovations developed through experience with Viking challenges. Alfred's law code attempted to balance traditional Germanic concepts of personal honour and compensation with the administrative needs of a kingdom under constant military pressure. These legal innovations provided frameworks for social cooperation that strengthened Saxon resistance, while establishing precedents for later English legal development. The Viking response to Saxon military innovations demonstrated the adaptive capabilities that made them such formidable opponents. As Saxon defences improved, Viking tactics evolved from simple hit-and-run raids to more sophisticated campaigns, involving the establishment of permanent bases, the recruitment of local allies, and the development of political relationships that could provide long-term advantages beyond immediate military success. The great army that invaded England in 865 represented a qualitatively different threat from earlier Viking raids. This force, led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, came not merely to raid, but to conquer and settle. Their systematic campaign against the Saxon kingdoms demonstrated strategic thinking that went far beyond opportunistic piracy, revealing Viking capabilities for sustained military operations and political organisation. The conquest of York by the Great Army in 866 eliminated Northumbria as an independent Saxon kingdom and established a Viking power base that would dominate northern England for generations. The speed and completeness of this victory demonstrated how quickly the political landscape of Saxon England could change when faced with determined and well-organised opposition. The subsequent campaigns of the Great Army against Mercia and East Anglia revealed the vulnerability of even the most powerful Saxon kingdoms to sustained pressure from mobile enemies who could coordinate their attacks while exploiting internal divisions within their targets. The capture and execution of King Edmund of East Anglia became a symbol of Saxon resistance, but also demonstrated the ultimate consequences of political fragmentation in the face of unified opposition. The invasion of Wessex by the Great Army in 870 brought the Viking conquest of England to its climactic phase. The kingdom that had emerged as the most successful Saxon state now faced the same systematic assault that had overwhelmed its neighbours. The initial Viking successes in Wessex seemed to presage the complete elimination of independent Saxon rule in England, reducing the proud kingdoms that had dominated British politics for centuries to the status of Viking tributaries. The Battle of Edington in 878 marked the turning point in the Saxon-Viking struggle, but not because it eliminated the Viking threat or restored Saxon dominance. Instead, Alfred's victory established a new equilibrium that recognized both Saxon and Viking claims to English territory, while creating frameworks for coexistence that would shape English development for the next 2 centuries. The Treaty of Wedmore that followed Edington represented a sophisticated diplomatic solution to what had seemed an irreconcilable conflict. By accepting Viking control over northeastern England, while securing Saxon authority in the southwest, the treaty created the political division known as the Danelaw that would profoundly influence English cultural and legal development. The Danelaw wasn't simply a region under Viking military occupation, but rather a zone where Scandinavian legal traditions, administrative practices, and cultural values took root alongside existing Anglo-Saxon institutions. The interaction between these different traditions created hybrid forms of government, law, and social organization that enriched English civilization while demonstrating the adaptability of both Saxon and Viking cultures. The establishment of Viking kingdoms at York and the 5 boroughs created new centres of political power that competed with traditional Saxon authority while contributing to the overall complexity of English political development. These Viking rulers weren't merely foreign conquerors, but gradually became integrated into the broader patterns of English kingship, adopting Christian faith and English administrative practices while maintaining distinctive cultural characteristics. The process of cultural synthesis that occurred within the Danelaw produced innovations in law, language, and social organisation that would have lasting impacts on English development. Viking legal concepts like the jury system and emphasis on compensation rather than punishment complemented Saxon traditions while providing new approaches to dispute resolution and community governance. The linguistic impact of Viking settlement extended far beyond the introduction of Scandinavian vocabulary into English. The interaction between Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon produced grammatical simplifications and structural changes that contributed to the development of Middle English, making the language more accessible to speakers from different linguistic backgrounds, while maintaining its essential Germanic character. The economic consequences of Viking settlement proved equally significant for English development. Scandinavian trading networks connected English markets to broader European and even global commerce, introducing new products, technologies, and commercial practices that stimulated economic growth and cultural exchange. The Viking emphasis on urban development led to the expansion of existing towns and the foundation of new commercial centres that would become important focuses of medieval English economic life. The religious implications of Viking conversion to Christianity represented another crucial dimension of cultural synthesis during this period. The adoption of Christian faith by Viking rulers didn't simply represent political accommodation, but involved genuine theological engagement that produced distinctive forms of religious expression, combining Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions. The artistic achievements that emerged from Saxon-Viking cultural interaction demonstrated the creative potential of this synthesis. The sculptural programs of churches in areas of heavy Scandinavian settlement combined traditional Christian iconography with motifs drawn from Norse mythology, creating distinctive artistic traditions that influenced English cultural development for centuries. The military innovations that resulted from Saxon-Viking conflict transformed warfare throughout medieval Europe. The tactical flexibility demanded by Viking mobility led to developments in fortification, cavalry warfare, and naval combat that influenced military practice far beyond the immediate context of English political struggle. As the 9th century drew to a close, the political landscape of England had been permanently transformed by the Viking invasions and the Saxon response to them. The unified Saxon kingdoms of the 8th century had given way to a more complex political structure that included both traditional Anglo-Saxon realms and new Viking territories, creating the foundation for the eventual emergence of a unified English kingdom that would combine the best elements of both traditions. The legacy of this period of conflict and accommodation would extend far beyond its immediate political consequences. The institutions, legal traditions, cultural practices, and social structures that emerged from Saxon-Viking interaction would provide the foundation for medieval English civilization and influence the development of English-speaking peoples throughout the world. The 10th century dawned upon an England forever changed, where the old certainties of Saxon supremacy had given way to a complex mosaic of competing loyalties, shared traditions, and emerging possibilities that would reshape the very foundations of English identity. The children who came of age in this transformed landscape knew nothing of the unified Saxon kingdoms their grandfathers had taken for granted, instead inheriting a world where Norse jarls ruled beside Saxon ealdormen, where Christian churches displayed runestone fragments in their foundations, and where the ancient rhythms of Germanic society had been forever altered by Scandinavian influence. In the halls of Winchester, the royal court of Wessex had evolved into something unprecedented in Saxon history. Alfred's successors found themselves ruling not merely over their ancestral West Saxon territories, but serving as focal points for a broader English identity that transcended the old tribal boundaries. The court attracted scholars, warriors, and craftsmen from throughout the island, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere where Latin learning coexisted with vernacular poetry, where continental diplomatic practices merged with Germanic concepts of lordship, and where the future of English civilization was being forged through daily interactions between peoples whose ancestors had been mortal enemies. The administrative machinery that supported this expanding royal authority represented a remarkable fusion of Saxon tradition with innovative approaches necessitated by the complexity of governing a multicultural kingdom. The shire system that emerged during this period combined Anglo-Saxon hundreds with administrative practices borrowed from Carolingian Francia, creating local government structures capable of maintaining royal authority across vast distances while accommodating regional variations in law and custom. Shire reeves, the king's representatives in local government, found themselves mediating between competing legal traditions, balancing the demands of royal taxation against local privileges and maintaining order among populations whose concepts of justice and social obligatio often differed fundamentally. The transformation of Saxon military organization during this period reflected not merely tactical adaptations to Viking warfare, but fundamental changes in the relationship between royal authority and local power structures. The traditional fyrd system, based on the obligation of free farmers to provide military service, had proven inadequate against professional Viking armies whose mobility and tactical sophistication demanded more flexible responses. The solution developed by Alfred and perfected by his successors involved the creation of standing military forces supported by royal estates and urban revenues, supplemented by a reformed fyrd that could respond more rapidly to emerging threats. The burh system, that formed the backbone of Saxon defensive strategy during this period, represented far more than military fortification. These fortified settlements served as administrative centres, commercial hubs, and cultural focal points that projected royal authority throughout the kingdom, while providing security for the agricultural populations upon which Saxon prosperity depended. The planning and construction of these burhs required sophisticated understanding of engineering, logistics, and urban design that demonstrated the administrative capabilities of the Saxon royal government. Archaeological evidence from burhs like Oxford, Wallingford, and Cricklade reveals the systematic nature of their construction and the careful attention paid to their integration with surrounding agricultural and commercial activities. These weren't merely military installations, but planned communities designed to serve multiple functions within the broader framework of royal administration. The regular layout of streets, the provision of market areas, the incorporation of churches and administrative buildings, and the careful attention to water supply and waste disposal all demonstrate sophisticated urban planning that drew upon both Roman precedents and contemporary continental models. The economic implications of the burh system extended far beyond their immediate military and administrative functions. By creating secure environments for craft production and commercial exchange, these fortified settlements stimulated economic development that generated the revenues necessary to support expanded royal government. The concentration of specialized craftsmen within burhs led to technological innovations and artistic achievements that enhanced the reputation of Saxon culture throughout medieval Europe. The development of Saxon coinage during this period provides crucial evidence for the sophistication of royal administration and the extent of commercial activity within the kingdom. The standardization of weights, measures, and silver content across multiple mints demonstrates central coordination that required extensive bureaucratic machinery and sophisticated understanding of monetary policy. The artistic quality of Saxon coins, with their carefully executed portraits and symbolic programs, reflects both the technical skills of royal mints and the importance attached to royal propaganda in maintaining political authority. The religious dimensions of 10th century Saxon society reveal the complex process by which Christianity became fully integrated into Germanic cultural traditions while maintaining its distinctive theological character. The monastic reform movement that flourished during this period, led by figures like Dunstan, Ethelwald, and Oswald, represented not merely spiritual renewal, but comprehensive cultural transformation that affected every aspect of Saxon society, from royal government to agricultural practice. The reformed monasteries that emerged during this period served multiple functions within Saxon society that extended far beyond their primary religious purposes. Monastic scriptoriums became centers for the production and preservation of books that maintained intellectual continuity with both classical antiquity and contemporary continental scholarship. The libraries of monasteries like Glastonbury, Winchester, and Worcester contained works of theology, history, literature, and practical knowledge that made them indispensable resources for royal administration and cultural development. The educational programs developed within reformed monasteries created the literate class that staffed royal administration and provided intellectual leadership for Saxon society. The curriculum that emerged in these schools combined traditional Germanic cultural elements with Christian theology and classical learning, producing educated elites whose understanding of governance, law, and diplomacy enabled Saxon kingdoms to participate effectively in the broader political and cultural networks of medieval Europe. The artistic achievements sponsored by reformed monasteries represent some of the highest expressions of Saxon cultural creativity. The illuminated manuscripts produced in monastic scriptoriums combined traditional Germanic decorative elements with influences drawn from Carolingian, Byzantine, and insular artistic traditions, creating distinctive visual styles that influenced artistic development throughout Northern Europe. The architectural programs of rebuilt monastic churches incorporated innovative engineering techniques with sophisticated decorative schemes that demonstrated both the wealth of Saxon religious institutions and their commitment to cultural excellence. The relationship between royal authority and monastic reform reveals the complex interplay between spiritual and political concerns that characterize Saxon society during this period. Kings like Edgar understood that strong monastic institutions provided essential support for royal government through their educational programs, their administrative expertise, and their moral authority within local communities. The royal patronage extended to reformed monasteries represented not merely pious generosity, but calculated political investment that strengthened the institutional foundations of Saxon kingship. The legal developments that occurred during the 10th century demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of jurisprudence that Saxon legal scholars brought to the challenges of governing increasingly complex societies. The law codes promulgated during this period attempted to balance competing legal traditions while establishing consistent standards of justice that could command respect across diverse populations. The influence of Christian moral principles on Saxon law created new approaches to punishment and rehabilitation that emphasized spiritual as well as social restoration for offenders. The integration of Scandinavian legal concepts into Saxon jurisprudence produced hybrid legal systems that combined the best elements of both traditions while addressing practical problems that neither could solve alone. The jury system that developed during this period drew upon both Saxon traditions of community judgment and Scandinavian practices of collective decision-making, creating judicial procedures that balanced popular participation with royal authority in ways that would influence English legal development for centuries. The commercial developments that characterized 10th century Saxon society reflected both the security provided by effective royal government and the stimulus of expanded trade networks that connected England to continental markets. The growth of towns like London, York, and Chester created commercial centres that facilitated long-distance trade while providing markets for agricultural surplus and craft production from their rural hinterlands. The archaeological record from these urban centres reveals evidence of craft specialisation, international trade, and economic prosperity that contradicts traditional assumptions about the limitations of early medieval commercial activity. The technological innovations that emerged during this period demonstrate the practical ingenuity that characterized Saxon responses to administrative and economic challenges. Improvements in agricultural techniques, particularly the development of the heavy plough and more sophisticated crop rotation systems, increased agricultural productivity that supported larger populations and released labour for craft production and military service. The development of water-powered mills for grain processing and cloth production represented significant technological advances that improved efficiency while reducing human labour requirements. The diplomatic activities of Saxon kingdoms during this period reveal their integration into broader European political networks and their sophisticated understanding of international relations. Marriage alliances with Frankish and German royal families created political relationships that provided security against external threats while facilitating cultural and commercial exchange. The correspondence between Saxon rulers and continental counterparts demonstrates their participation in the intellectual and political culture of medieval Christendom. The military campaigns conducted by Saxon forces during the reconquest of the Danelaw reveal both the effectiveness of military reforms and the political sophistication of Saxon strategic thinking. The systematic approach adopted by Edward the Elder and Aethelflaed in their campaigns against Viking territories combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiation and administrative consolidation, ensuring that conquered territories could be effectively integrated into Saxon political structures rather than simply occupied by military force. The cultural synthesis that occurred during the reconquest of the Danelaw created new forms of English identity that transcended the old divisions between Saxon and Scandinavian populations. The integration of Viking settlers into Saxon administrative and religious structures occurred through processes of accommodation and adaptation that preserved valuable elements of both cultures while creating new institutional forms suited to the changed circumstances of English society. The literary achievements of 10th century Saxon culture demonstrate the vitality of vernacular traditions that had successfully adapted to Christian and continental influences while maintaining their distinctive character. The poetry produced during this period combined traditional Germanic metres and themes with Christian subject matter and classical learning, creating works that express the complex cultural identity of Saxon society during this transformative period. The architectural developments that occurred throughout Saxon territories during the 10th century reflect both the prosperity of the kingdom and the sophistication of Saxon building techniques. The construction of new churches, royal halls, and defensive works required engineering skills and organizational capabilities that demonstrated the maturation of Saxon civilization. The incorporation of continental architectural elements into traditional Germanic building forms created distinctive architectural styles that influenced construction throughout medieval England. As the 10th century progressed toward its close, the Saxon kingdoms had achieved a stability and prosperity that seemed to vindicate the policies of unification and reform that had guided royal government since Alfred's time. The threats that had once seemed capable of destroying Saxon civilization had been contained or overcome, while the institutions that would govern England for centuries had been established and tested through decades of practical experience. Yet beneath this surface stability, new challenges were emerging that would test Saxon resilience once again and ultimately transform the kingdom in ways that none of its 10th century rulers could have anticipated. The winds of change that would sweep across Saxon England in the final decades of the 10th century carried with them the seeds of transformation that would fundamentally alter the character of English civilization. The relative stability that had marked the middle years of the century began to show signs of strain as new pressures emerged from both internal political tensions and external threats that challenged the carefully constructed balance of power that Saxon rulers had worked for generations to establish. The reign of Ethilred, who would later earn the unfortunate epithet, the Unready, began with promise, but quickly revealed the fragility of the political system that his predecessors had created. The young king inherited a kingdom that appeared prosperous and secure, but beneath the surface lay tensions that would prove increasingly difficult to manage. The nobility that had served his ancestors faithfully found themselves divided by competing ambitions and conflicting loyalties that reflected the complex cultural heritage of English society. The administrative system that had seemed so effective under strong leadership proved vulnerable to the uncertainties that surrounded royal authority when that leadership faltered. Local officials who had faithfully executed royal policy under previous kings began to pursue their own interests when central direction became unclear or inconsistent. The delicate balance between royal prerogative and noble privilege that had maintained political stability required constant attention and skilled management that the new regime struggled to provide. The economic prosperity that had supported Saxon military and administrative expansion began to show signs of strain as the costs of maintaining elaborate governmental machinery exceeded the revenues that traditional sources could provide. The taxation system that had evolved during the previous century depended on the willing cooperation of local communities whose prosperity had made such cooperation feasible, but economic pressures and political uncertainties gradually eroded this cooperative spirit. The military reforms that had proved so effective against Viking threats revealed their limitations when faced with new types of challenges that required different tactical approaches and strategic thinking. The standing forces that had been created to deal with mobile raiding armies proved expensive to maintain during periods of apparent peace, while the reformed fyrd system required coordination and leadership that became increasingly difficult to provide as political authority became more fragmented. The monastic institutions that had provided intellectual leadership and administrative support for Saxon government found themselves caught between competing demands for their resources and loyalties. The wealth that they had accumulated through royal patronage and popular devotion made them attractive targets for ambitious nobles seeking to finance their political activities, while their spiritual authority gave them influence that various factions sought to exploit for secular purposes. The cultural confidence that had characterized Saxon society during its period of expansion and consolidation began to give way to uncertainty about the future direction of English development. The synthesis of Saxon and Scandinavian traditions that had enriched English culture during the Reconquest period created new possibilities for cultural expression, but also raised questions about the essential character of English identity that would become increasingly pressing as external pressures mounted. The return of Viking raiders to English shores during the 980s represented more than a revival of familiar military threats. These new attackers brought with them tactical innovations and strategic objectives that differed significantly from their 9th century predecessors. The Vikings, who now threatened English security, were no longer primarily interested in settlement and territorial conquest, but sought instead to extract maximum wealth through systematic exploitation of English prosperity. The professional armies that descended upon English coastal communities possessed military capabilities that had been refined through decades of warfare throughout northern Europe. Their leaders understood siege warfare, naval tactics, and logistical organization in ways that made them formidable opponents, even for the reformed military forces that Saxon kingdoms could deploy against them. The mobility that had always characterized Viking warfare was now enhanced by improved ship design and more sophisticated understanding of weather patterns and navigation techniques. The psychological warfare employed by these new Viking forces proved as effective as their military capabilities in undermining English resistance. Their reputation for ruthless efficiency and their apparent ability to strike at will created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that made effective defense planning extremely difficult. Communities that had grown accustomed to security under Saxon protection found themselves vulnerable to attacks that could materialize without warning and disappear before effective countermeasures could be organized. The political consequences of renewed Viking pressure extended far beyond the immediate military challenges that English forces faced on the battlefield. The need to respond rapidly to threats that could emerge at any point along England's extensive coastline strained the administrative resources of royal government and created opportunities for ambitious nobles to enhance their own power at the expense of central authority. Local defense requirements often conflicted with broader strategic priorities, creating tensions between royal policy and regional needs that proved increasingly difficult to resolve. The diplomatic complexities that surrounded England's relationships with continental powers became more pressing as Viking threats intensified. The need for allies who could provide military assistance or diplomatic pressure against Viking bases required careful management of international relationships that had implications extending far beyond immediate military concerns. Marriage alliances, commercial agreements, and religious connections all became factors in the complex calculations that determined English foreign policy. The financial burden imposed by the need to maintain constant military readiness gradually overwhelmed the fiscal resources that had supported Saxon governmental expansion during the previous century. The traditional sources of royal revenue proved inadequate for the sustained military expenditure required to counter persistent Viking threats, forcing English rulers to explore new approaches to taxation that created tensions with the very populations whose support was essential for effective defense. The social disruption caused by repeated Viking attacks began to undermine the stability that had characterized English rural communities during the period of Saxon consolidation. Agricultural productivity declined as farmers devoted more time to defensive preparations and less to crop cultivation, while the constant threat of attack made long-term agricultural improvements risky investments that few were willing to undertake. The movement of population from exposed coastal areas to more secure inland locations disrupted established social relationships and economic networks. The cultural impact of renewed Viking pressure manifested itself in changes to artistic expression, literary themes, and religious practice that reflected the anxieties and uncertainties of English society during this troubled period. The confident cultural synthesis that had characterized 10th century English civilization gave way to more defensive attitudes that emphasized preservation rather than innovation, survival rather than expansion, and security rather than achievement. The religious dimensions of the Viking renewal revealed the complex relationship between spiritual and secular concerns that characterized English responses to external pressure. The monastic communities that had flourished under royal patronage found themselves primary targets for Viking attacks, not merely because of their wealth, but because of their symbolic importance as representatives of English Christian culture. The destruction of monasteries and the slaughter of monks served Viking psychological warfare objectives while depriving English society of crucial sources of intellectual and spiritual leadership. The administrative challenges created by the need to coordinate defense against multiple simultaneous threats revealed the limitations of the governmental system that had evolved during periods of relative stability. The bureaucratic machinery that had proved effective for routine administration struggled to adapt to the rapid decision-making and flexible resource allocation required for crisis management. Communication systems that worked adequately under normal circumstances proved inadequate for coordinating military responses across the extensive territories that comprised the English kingdom. The legal implications of prolonged military emergency created tensions between traditional concepts of justice and the practical requirements of national defence. The normal operation of courts and legal procedures became difficult when populations were displaced, evidence was destroyed, and witnesses were unavailable due to military service or enemy action. The need to maintain social order while mobilizing resources for defense required legal innovations that balanced individual rights against collective security needs. The technological challenges posed by improved Viking military capabilities forced English craftsmen and military engineers to develop new approaches to fortification, weapon production, and naval construction. The defensive works that had proved adequate against earlier Viking attacks required modification to counter new siege techniques and artillery capabilities. The weapons and armour that English forces required for effective combat against professional Viking armies demanded improvements in metallurgical techniques and manufacturing organisation. The economic disruption caused by sustained military pressure created opportunities for some while destroying the livelihoods of others, contributing to social tensions that complicated political responses to external threats. Merchants who could adapt their operations to wartime conditions sometimes profited from the increased demand for military supplies and the disruption of normal trade patterns, while farmers and craftsmen in exposed areas often lost everything to Viking raids and were forced to depend on royal or noble charity for survival. The demographic consequences of Viking attacks and English defensive responses began to alter the population distribution and social structure of English society in ways that would have long-term implications for cultural and political development. The concentration of population in fortified centres created new forms of urban life that differed significantly from the rural communities that had dominated English society during the Saxon consolidation period, while the military casualties suffered during prolonged conflicts affected the composition of the warrior class that provided political leadership. The intellectual impact of renewed crisis manifested itself in changes to educational priorities and scholarly activities that reflected the practical needs of a society under siege. The theoretical learning that had flourished in monastic schools during peaceful periods gave way to more practical curricula that emphasized military engineering, administrative efficiency, and diplomatic skills needed for survival in a hostile environment. The preservation of books and learning became secondary to the immediate requirements of defense and governance. The psychological toll of constant military pressure began to affect the collective mentality of English society in ways that influenced political decisions, social relationships, and cultural expression. The confidence and optimism that had characterized English attitudes during the period of expansion and consolidation gave way to more defensive mindsets that emphasized caution over boldness, preservation over innovation, and survival over achievement. These changes in collective psychology would have profound implications for English responses to the challenges that lay ahead. The international dimensions of England's crisis attracted attention from continental powers, whose own interests were affected by the stability of English government and the success of Viking military enterprises. The complex web of relationships that connected English rulers to Frankish, German, and Scandinavian courts created both opportunities for assistance and risks of entanglement in broader conflicts that could further complicate England's defensive problems. As the final decade of the 10th century approached, English society found itself at a crossroads where the choices made by political leaders and the responses of ordinary people would determine whether the achievements of Saxon civilization could be preserved and transmitted to future generations, or whether England would become another victim of the military and political forces that were reshaping medieval Europe. The institutions, traditions, and cultural values that had been built over centuries of patient development would soon face their ultimate test in confrontations that would determine the future course of English history. The decisions made during these crucial years would establish precedents and create consequences that would influence English development for centuries to come. The balance between resistance and accommodation, between preservation and adaptation, between local autonomy and central authority, would be determined through choices made under extreme pressure by people whose primary concern was survival, but whose actions would shape the destiny of generations yet unborn. The story of Saxon England was approaching its climactic phase, where all the themes that had developed over centuries of cultural evolution would converge in dramatic confrontations that would either vindicate the Saxon achievement or demonstrate its ultimate inadequacy in the face of forces beyond its control. The outcome of this crisis would determine not only the immediate fate of English society, but also the fundamental character of the civilization that would emerge from the crucible of conflict and change. The morning mist that shrouded the Thames estuary on that October day in 991 carried more than the usual sense of salt and seaweed. It bore witness to a moment that would crystallize all the tensions and contradictions that had been building within English society for the better part of a generation. At Maldon, where the river meets the sea, two armies faced each other across the narrow causeway that connected Northey Island to the mainland, each representing not merely competing military forces, but fundamentally different visions of how power should be exercised and civilization should be ordered. The English force that assembled under Byrhtnoth, Ealdorman of Essex, embodied all the strengths and weaknesses of the governmental system that had evolved during the Saxon consolidation. These weren't the professional warriors who had conquered Britain centuries earlier, but the products of a society that had grown prosperous through agriculture, trade, and careful administration. Many carried weapons that had been passed down through generations, symbols of family honor rather than tools of daily violence, while others bore newly forged arms that reflected the wealth of communities that had known decades of relative peace. The Vikings who faced them across the water represented something entirely different, something that perhaps reminded older English warriors of their own ancestral heritage. These weren't settlers seeking new homes, or raiders looking for quick plunder, but professional soldiers whose entire existence revolved around the perfection of military skills and the accumulation of wealth through systematic warfare. Their weapons showed the wear of constant use. Their armor bore the modifications that only experienced fighters would make, and their bearing reflected the confidence that comes from repeated success in the most demanding of all human endeavors. The negotiations that preceded the battle revealed the profound cultural gap that separated these two forces despite their shared Germanic heritage. When the Viking herald called across the water demanding tribute in exchange for peace, he spoke in terms that would have been perfectly comprehensible to Saxon warriors of an earlier generation. The offer was straightforward. Acknowledge superior force, pay appropriate compensation, and avoid the uncertainties of battle where victory could never be guaranteed, regardless of numerical advantage or moral righteousness. Byrhtnoth's response reflected the complex identity that English society had developed during its centuries of Christian civilization and administrative sophistication. The Ealdorman couldn't simply accept the Viking terms without betraying the trust that his king and his people had placed in him. Yet neither could he ignore the practical realities of military confrontation with experienced enemies whose capabilities he understood all too well. His decision to allow the Vikings' passage across the causeway for the sake of a fair fight has been debated by historians for centuries, but it embodied perfectly the tensions between honor and pragmatism that characterized English leadership during this period. The battle itself unfolded with a terrible inevitability that demonstrated both the courage of English resistance and the professional competence of Viking warfare. The English shield wall, formed according to tactics that had served Saxon armies well for generations, initially held firm against Viking attacks that tested but couldn't break their formation. The individual combat skills of English warriors proved adequate for the demands of battle, while their determination to defend their homeland provided the moral strength necessary to stand firm against enemies whose reputation for ferocity was well established. Yet as the fighting continued, the advantages that professional military experience provided began to tell against the English force. Viking tactical flexibility allowed them to exploit weaknesses in English formation that less experienced opponents might never have noticed, while their superior conditioning and equipment gave them stamina for prolonged combat that militia forces couldn't match. The death of Byrhtnoth during the height of the battle removed the leadership that held the English force together, creating the confusion that professional armies are trained to exploit ruthlessly. The collapse of English resistance at Maldon wasn't simply a military defeat, but a symbolic demonstration of the limitations that Saxon civilization faced when confronted by enemies who retained the pure warrior culture that the English had gradually modified through centuries of settlement and development. The Vikings, who stripped the battlefield of valuable equipment and carried away prisoners for ransom, weren't celebrating a victory over inferior opponents, but rather demonstrating the continuing relevance of military values that English society had never completely abandoned, but had certainly subordinated to other priorities. The aftermath of Maldon revealed the complex calculations that now governed English responses to Viking pressure. The immediate military consequences of the defeat were serious, but not catastrophic. The Viking force remained relatively small and couldn't hope to conquer English territories through military action alone. The political implications proved far more significant, as the defeat undermined confidence in the defensive capabilities of royal government, while encouraging other Viking forces to test English resolve through similar attacks. The decision to pay tribute to the Vikings rather than risk further military confrontations represented a fundamental shift in English policy that acknowledged realities that many English leaders found difficult to accept. The Danegeld, as this tribute came to be known, provided a practical solution to an immediate problem while creating precedents that would shape English policy for the remainder of the Saxon period. The gold and silver that flowed from English treasuries to Viking war chests represented more than simple extortion. It constituted recognition that military force remained the ultimate arbiter of political relationships, regardless of the sophisticated administrative and legal systems that civilized societies might develop. The collection of Danegeld required governmental capabilities that demonstrated both the strengths and the costs of the administrative system that Saxon rulers had created over the previous century. The ability to assess, collect, and transport the enormous sums demanded by Viking leaders proved that English royal government possessed bureaucratic machinery of remarkable efficiency and scope. The tax assessment records that survive from this period reveal systematic evaluation of wealth and resources that exceeded anything previously attempted in medieval Europe, while the logistics of collection and payment required coordination between royal officials, local administrators, and community leaders across the entire kingdom. Yet the social and economic costs of this fiscal achievement proved enormous and lasting. The burden of Danegeld fell most heavily on the agricultural communities that formed the foundation of English prosperity, forcing farmers to surrender not merely surplus wealth, but often the capital resources necessary for future productivity. The disruption of local economies created hardships that rippled through English society, affecting craft production, commercial activity, and the social relationships that bound communities together. The political consequences of Danegeld collection created tensions between royal authority and local interests that would influence English governmental development for generations. The need to extract maximum revenues in minimum time required coercive measures that contradicted the traditions of consultation and consent that had characterized Saxon political culture. Local officials found themselves enforcing policies that they knew would damage the communities they served, while royal administrators struggled to balance the demands of immediate necessity against the long-term requirements of effective governance. The psychological impact of tribute payment extended far beyond its immediate financial costs to affect the collective identity and self-perception of English society. The acknowledgement that Viking military superiority could compel English submission challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between civilization and barbarism, between Christian virtue and pagan violence, between administrative sophistication and military effectiveness that had shaped English culture during the period of Saxon consolidation. The international implications of English tribute payments reverberated throughout northern Europe, affecting the calculations of rulers and raiders across Scandinavia while influencing the diplomatic relationships that connected English kings to continental courts. The demonstration that systematic pressure could extract enormous wealth from England encouraged other Viking leaders to organize similar expeditions, while the precedent of successful tribute collection established England's reputation as a source of ready wealth that could be tapped through appropriate military pressure. The religious dimensions of England's crisis created particular anguish for a society that had come to see its Christian identity as fundamental to its cultural superiority over pagan enemies. The apparent inability of divine providence to protect a Christian kingdom against heathen attackers raised theological questions that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between faith and worldly success. Monastic chroniclers struggled to explain how God could permit such suffering to befall his faithful servants, while allowing pagan raiders to prosper through violence and extortion. The intellectual response to these challenges produced some of the most sophisticated theological and political thinking of the early medieval period. Scholars like Wulfstan of York developed complex analyses of English society that identified moral and spiritual failures as the root causes of military defeat, while proposing comprehensive programs of reform that would restore divine favor through renewed commitment to Christian virtue and social justice. These analyses went far beyond simple moralizing to encompass systematic critiques of English governmental, legal, and social institutions that revealed deep understanding of the relationships between political structure and cultural values. The administrative reforms attempted during this period of crisis demonstrated both the adaptability of Saxon governmental institutions and their ultimate limitations when faced with challenges that exceeded their original design parameters. Efforts to improve military efficiency through better coordination of local forces, enhanced intelligence gathering, and more systematic provisioning showed sophisticated understanding of the practical requirements for effective defense. Yet these reforms also revealed the extent to which English administrative capabilities depended on the willing cooperation of local communities, whose support became increasingly difficult to maintain as the costs of defense continued to escalate. The military innovations introduced during the later Viking Wars reflected English efforts to adapt their tactical and strategic approaches to counter the advantages that professional Viking armies possessed through mobility, experience, and tactical flexibility. The development of English naval capabilities represented a particularly significant achievement, as Saxon shipbuilding techniques evolved to produce vessels capable of intercepting Viking raiders before they could reach English shores. These technological advances required substantial investments in materials, skilled labor, and organizational coordination that demonstrated the continuing vitality of English craftsmanship and administrative capability. The fortification programs undertaken during this period created defensive networks that represented some of the most ambitious engineering projects of the early medieval period. The systematic strengthening of existing burhs and the construction of new fortified positions required careful coordination between royal planners, local administrators, and the communities that would garrison and maintain these installations. The architectural innovations developed for these projects, including improved wall construction techniques, more sophisticated gate defenses, and better integration of military and civilian functions, influenced fortification design throughout medieval Europe. The economic adjustments forced upon English society by prolonged military pressure created both hardships and opportunities that reshaped the foundations of English prosperity. The disruption of traditional agricultural patterns led to experimentation with new crops and farming techniques that sometimes proved more productive than earlier methods, while the demand for military supplies stimulated craft production and technological innovation in metalworking, textile production, and other essential industries. The social changes that accompanied England's military crisis affected relationships between different classes and communities in ways that would have lasting implications for English cultural development. The shared experience of external threat created bonds between social groups that had previously had limited interaction. while the common burden of tribute payment created new forms of solidarity that transcended traditional hierarchical divisions. The mobility required for military service and defensive preparations brought people from different regions into contact with each other, facilitating cultural exchange and the development of more unified English identity. The cultural expressions that emerged during this period of crisis reflected both the anxieties and the resilience that characterized English responses to external pressure. The poetry produced during these years combined traditional Germanic heroic themes with Christian moral instruction and contemporary political commentary, creating works that spoke directly to the experiences and concerns of audiences facing unprecedented challenges. The artistic production of this period, while often focused on portable wealth that could be hidden or transported during emergencies, maintained the technical excellence and aesthetic sophistication that had characterized English craftsmanship during more peaceful times. The diplomatic activities that surrounded English efforts to manage Viking pressure revealed the kingdom's integration into broader European political networks, while demonstrating the limitations of international cooperation in addressing military threats. Attempts to coordinate defensive measures with Frankish and German rulers produced limited practical results, while efforts to negotiate with Scandinavian kings who might influence Viking raiders required careful management of complex political relationships that often conflicted with immediate English interests. The legal developments that occurred during this period of sustained crisis reflected efforts to maintain social order and governmental authority under conditions that strained traditional institutional capabilities. The elaboration of treason laws and the enhancement of royal judicial prerogatives demonstrated attempts to strengthen central authority against internal as well as external threats, while innovations in commercial law and debt collection reflected the practical requirements of financing sustained military operations. As England approached the final years of the 10th century, the accumulated stresses of prolonged military pressure, fiscal exhaustion, and social disruption had created conditions that would test the fundamental resilience of Saxon civilization. The institutions that had served English society well during periods of expansion and consolidation now faced challenges that would determine whether the achievements of centuries could be preserved and transmitted to future generations, or whether England would succumb to the same forces that had overwhelmed other European kingdoms during this turbulent period. The choices that lay ahead would require wisdom, courage, and adaptability that would draw upon all the resources that Saxon culture had developed over its long evolution. The outcome would determine not only the immediate survival of English independence, but also the fundamental character of the civilization that would emerge from this crucible of conflict and transformation. The dawn of the 11th century found England suspended between hope and despair, its future hanging in the balance like morning mist over a battlefield where the outcome remained undecided. The young King Ethelred, now bearing the full weight of royal responsibility, faced challenges that would have tested rulers far more experienced in the arts of war and statecraft. The comfortable certainties that had guided his predecessors had evaporated in the heat of Viking raids and the corrosive effects of tribute payments that drained the kingdom's wealth while failing to purchase lasting security. The court at Winchester had become a place of whispered conversations and anxious deliberations, where every messenger's arrival brought fresh reports of ships sighted off distant coasts, or demands for tribute from Viking leaders whose names had become as familiar as those of English nobles. The royal council that gathered in the Great Hall faced decisions that would have seemed unthinkable to earlier generations of Saxon rulers, weighing the relative merits of military resistance against diplomatic accommodation, of preserving royal dignity against ensuring popular survival. The administrative machinery that had once seemed the pinnacle of governmental sophistication now groaned under pressures it had never been designed to handle. Royal clerks who had previously concerned themselves with routine matters of land grants and judicial appeals found themselves calculating tribute assessments and coordinating defensive measures across territories that seemed to shrink daily under the pressure of external threats. The Shire reeves, who served as the kingdom's administrative backbone, discovered that their traditional authority meant little when faced with Viking warbands whose only law was strength and whose only loyalty was to successful leadership. The transformation of English society under these pressures revealed both its underlying strengths and its fundamental vulnerabilities. Communities that had prospered through agricultural surplus and craft specialization found themselves forced to adapt to conditions where survival depended more on defensive capability than productive efficiency. The careful balance between royal authority and local autonomy that had characterized Saxon political development began to shift as crisis conditions demanded more centralized decision-making, while simultaneously making such coordination increasingly difficult to achieve. The warrior culture that had once driven Saxon expansion but had been gradually modified through centuries of settlement and Christianization suddenly reasserted its relevance as communities rediscovered the harsh realities that their ancestors had understood instinctively. Young men who might have expected to inherit their fathers' farms or workshops instead found themselves training with weapons whose use they hoped never to need, while their elders shared stories of battles fought in distant times when Saxon prowess had seemed sufficient to overcome any challenge. The economic disruption caused by sustained military pressure created ripple effects that touched every aspect of English life. Markets that had flourished during peaceful decades found their trade networks severed by the constant threat of attack, while craftsmen who had specialized in luxury goods discovered that their skills were less valued than those of smiths who could forge weapons and armorers who could repair battle damage. The agricultural communities that formed the foundation of English prosperity faced the impossible choice between maintaining productivity and ensuring security, often finding that attempts to achieve both resulted in failure at each. The religious response to England's crisis reflected the complex relationship between spiritual faith and worldly success that had always characterized Christian civilization. Monasteries that had served as centers of learning and cultural preservation found themselves primary targets for Viking attacks, not merely because of their accumulated wealth, but because of their symbolic importance as representatives of English Christian identity. The destruction of sacred sites and the slaughter of religious communities created theological challenges that demanded explanation, while providing propaganda advantages to enemies who understood the psychological impact of such attacks. The intellectual ferment that emerged from these challenges produced some of the most sophisticated political and theological thinking of the early medieval period. Scholars working in surviving monastic centers developed complex analyses of England's predicament that went far beyond simple military or political explanations to encompass comprehensive critiques of English society and proposals for fundamental reform. These analyses revealed deep understanding of the relationships between governmental structure, social organization, and cultural values that would influence English thought for centuries to come. The military innovations forced upon English armies by the necessities of Viking warfare demonstrated both the adaptability of Saxon martial traditions and their limitations when confronted by enemies whose entire existence revolved around perfecting combat skills. The traditional shield wall tactics that had served Saxon armies well against similar opponents proved increasingly inadequate against Viking forces, whose mobility and tactical flexibility allowed them to exploit weaknesses that less experienced enemies might never have discovered. The development of English naval capabilities during this period represented a particularly significant achievement that required substantial technological innovation and organizational coordination. Saxon shipwrights learned to construct vessels capable of matching Viking longships in speed and seaworthiness, while incorporating design improvements that reflected English understanding of their specific defensive requirements. The creation of naval forces capable of intercepting Viking raiders before they could reach English shores required not only technical expertise, but also the development of intelligence networks and communication systems that could provide early warning of approaching threats. The fortification programs undertaken during the later Viking Wars created defensive networks of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The systematic strengthening of existing burhs and the construction of new fortified positions required careful coordination between royal planners and local communities, who would bear the costs of construction while providing the garrisons necessary for effective defense. The architectural innovations developed for these projects incorporated lessons learned from earlier defensive failures, while anticipating the evolving tactical capabilities of Viking siege warfare. The social changes that accompanied England's prolonged crisis affected relationships between different classes and regions in ways that would permanently alter the character of English society. The shared experience of external threat created new forms of solidarity that transcended traditional hierarchical divisions, while the mobility required for military service brought people from different areas into contact with each other in ways that facilitated cultural exchange and the development of more unified English identity. The diplomatic complexities that surrounded English efforts to manage Viking pressure revealed both the kingdom's integration into broader European political networks and the limitations of international cooperation when faced with threats that transcended traditional political boundaries. Attempts to coordinate defensive measures with continental allies produced mixed results, while efforts to negotiate directly with Scandinavian rulers who might influence Viking activities required careful management of relationships that often conflicted with immediate English interests. The cultural expressions that emerged during this period reflected both the anxieties and the resilience that characterized English responses to unprecedented challenges. The literature produced during these years combined traditional themes with contemporary concerns in ways that spoke directly to audiences facing uncertainties that their ancestors had never imagined. The artistic production of the period, while often constrained by the need to create portable wealth that could be protected during emergencies, maintained standards of technical excellence that demonstrated the continuing vitality of English craftsmanship. The legal developments that occurred during this crisis period revealed efforts to maintain social order and governmental authority under conditions that strained traditional institutional capabilities beyond their design limits. The elaboration of laws dealing with treason and military service reflected attempts to strengthen royal authority while ensuring that communities could meet their defensive obligations, while innovations in commercial law addressed the practical requirements of financing sustained military operations. The psychological toll of prolonged crisis began to manifest itself in changes to collective mentality that affected everything from artistic expression to political decision-making. The confidence and optimism that had characterized English attitudes during the period of Saxon consolidation gave way to more defensive mindsets that emphasize preservation over expansion, survival over achievement, and caution over boldness. These changes in collective psychology would have profound implications for English responses to the even greater challenges that lay ahead. The international reputation of England during this period underwent significant transformation as the kingdom's military vulnerabilities became apparent to observers throughout Northern Europe. The demonstration that systematic pressure could extract enormous tribute payments from English royal treasuries encouraged other potential adversaries, while undermining the diplomatic relationships that had provided security through alliance and mutual interest. The precedent of successful tribute collection established England's reputation as a source of ready wealth that could be accessed through appropriate military pressure. The administrative innovations developed in response to crisis conditions demonstrated both the adaptability of Saxon governmental institutions and their ultimate limitations when faced with challenges that exceeded their original parameters. Efforts to improve military coordination through better intelligence gathering and more systematic provisioning showed sophisticated understanding of defensive requirements, while attempts to enhance fiscal efficiency revealed the extent to which English administrative capabilities depended on the willing cooperation of communities whose support became increasingly difficult to maintain as costs continued to escalate. The technological achievements that emerged from the necessities of sustained warfare included significant advances in metallurgy, engineering, and logistics that would influence English development long after the immediate crisis had passed. The demand for weapons and armour stimulated innovations in iron and steel production that improved both quality and quantity of military equipment, while the requirements of defensive construction led to advances in masonry and timber engineering that found applications in civilian as well as military projects. The economic adjustments forced upon English society created both immediate hardships and long-term structural changes that reshaped the foundations of English prosperity. The disruption of traditional trade patterns led to the development of new commercial relationships and the exploration of previously neglected resources, while the demands of military finance encouraged innovations in banking and credit that would prove crucial for future economic development. As the first decade of the new century progressed, the accumulated effects of prolonged pressure began to create conditions that would test the fundamental resilience of everything Saxon civilization had achieved. The institutions that had served English society during centuries of gradual development now faced challenges that would determine whether the cultural and political achievements of generations could survive the crucible of systematic assault by enemies who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of the civilization they sought to exploit. The young men who came of age during these troubled years inherited a world vastly different from that of their fathers, one where the comfortable assumptions of earlier generations had been shattered by harsh realities that demanded new approaches to problems that had once seemed permanently solved. Their responses to these challenges would shape not only their own survival, but the fundamental character of whatever civilization emerged from the trials that lay ahead. The choices that confronted English leadership during these crucial years involved more than simple questions of military strategy or diplomatic accommodation. They required fundamental decisions about the nature of English identity, the proper relationship between rulers and subjects, and the extent to which traditional values could be preserved while adapting to circumstances that their creators had never anticipated. The wisdom or folly of these choices would determine whether Saxon England would survive as a distinctive civilization or become merely another casualty in the broader transformation of medieval Europe. The story that had begun with Saxon longships crossing the North Sea toward unknown shores was approaching its climactic phase, where all the themes developed over centuries of cultural evolution would converge in confrontations that would either vindicate the Saxon achievement or reveal its ultimate inadequacy when faced with forces beyond its control. The outcome would determine not only the immediate fate of English independence, but also the fundamental character of the island's future, establishing precedents that would influence the development of English-speaking civilization for centuries to come. Years to come. The winter of 1013 descended upon England like a shroud, carrying with it winds that bore more than seasonal cold. Across the grey waters of the North Sea came news that would transform the very foundations of Saxon civilization, as Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, assembled the most formidable invasion force that Northern Europe had witnessed since the great migrations of centuries past. This wasn't another raiding expedition seeking quick plunder, but a systematic campaign of conquest that would test every institution, every loyalty, and every assumption upon which English society had been built. The Danish fleet that materialized off the English coast represented the culmination of decades of military evolution and political consolidation in Scandinavia. These weren't the improvised warbands of earlier Viking raids, but professional armies equipped with the finest weapons that northern metallurgy could produce, organized according to tactical principles refined through generations of warfare, and led by commanders whose understanding of siegecraft and strategic planning rivaled that of any military force in medieval Europe. The ships themselves embodied technological sophistication that reflected the accumulated knowledge of centuries of maritime innovation, their sleek hulls capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers with equal facility. Sweyn's strategic approach revealed planning capabilities that went far beyond the opportunistic raiding that had characterized earlier Viking campaigns. The Danish king understood that conquering England required more than military victory. It demanded the systematic dismantling of Saxon political structures and their replacement with administrative systems capable of governing a sophisticated urban civilization. His forces moved with purpose that reflected careful intelligence gathering and detailed knowledge of English defensive capabilities, striking at targets whose capture would maximize political impact while minimizing military resistance. The English response to this unprecedented threat revealed both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of the governmental system that had evolved during centuries of Saxon rule. Local commanders who had proven effective against smaller Viking forces found themselves overwhelmed by the scale and coordination of Danish operations, while the administrative machinery that had served Saxon kings admirably during peacetime proved inadequate for coordinating resistance against enemies who could strike simultaneously across multiple fronts. The psychological warfare that accompanied Danish military operations proved as devastating as their tactical superiority. Sweyn's forces demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of English social psychology, targeting symbols of royal authority and Christian identity with calculated precision designed to undermine popular confidence in Saxon leadership. The systematic destruction of monasteries and royal estates served strategic purposes that went beyond simple material gain, creating visible demonstrations of Saxon impotence that encouraged collaboration while discouraging resistance. The collapse of English resistance proceeded with a terrible inevitability that reflected fundamental structural problems within Saxon political organization. The kingdom that had seemed so powerful and unified during periods of external peace revealed itself to be a collection of competing interests held together by personal loyalties and traditional obligations that proved inadequate when tested by systematic pressure from professional enemies who understood the weaknesses inherent in decentralized authority structures. King Ethelred's flight to Normandy represented more than personal failure. It symbolized the bankruptcy of the political system that had governed England for centuries. The royal court that had once attracted scholars and diplomats from throughout Europe dissolved into exile and uncertainty, while the administrative apparatus that had collected tribute and coordinated defense simply ceased to function when deprived of the central authority that had given it meaning and purpose. The Danish occupation that followed Sweyn's conquest imposed new forms of governance that combined Scandinavian administrative practices with pragmatic accommodation to English local traditions. The new rulers understood that effective control over England required more than military domination. It demanded the creation of political structures that could command the loyalty, or at least the acquiescence of populations whose cooperation was essential for maintaining the agricultural productivity and commercial activity that made conquest profitable. The transformation of English noble families during this period revealed the complex calculations that governed political survival under foreign occupation. Saxon aristocrats who had served English kings for generations found themselves forced to choose between exile with their former sovereigns or accommodation with new rulers whose cultural backgrounds and political objectives differed fundamentally from those of their predecessors. The decisions made by these families would determine not only their personal survival, but also the continuity of English cultural traditions through this period of political upheaval. The religious implications of Danish conquest created particular challenges for English Christian communities that had come to identify their faith with political independence and cultural superiority over pagan enemies. The conversion of many Danish leaders to Christianity complicated simple narratives of religious conflict, while the pragmatic policies of Danish administrators toward existing ecclesiastical institutions revealed sophisticated understanding of the role that religious authority played in maintaining social stability. The economic adjustments required by Danish rule affected every level of English society, from the royal treasuries that now served foreign masters to the agricultural communities that bore the burden of supporting new military establishments. The tribute systems that had been developed to purchase peace from Viking raiders were transformed into permanent taxation structures that generated revenues for Danish governmental operations, while traditional patterns of trade and craft production adapted to serve new markets and different political priorities. The cultural synthesis that began during the Danish occupation created new forms of artistic expression and intellectual activity that reflected the complex identity of English society under foreign rule. Scribes working in monastic scriptoriums found ways to preserve Saxon literary traditions while acknowledging the political realities that now governed their world, producing works that maintained cultural continuity while adapting to changed circumstances. The military innovations that emerged from Danish administrative practices influenced the development of English warfare for centuries to come. The professional standing armies that Danish rulers maintained in England introduced new standards of military organisation and tactical sophistication that would be adopted by subsequent English kings, while the fortification programmes undertaken by Danish administrators created defensive networks that enhanced the strategic value of key territories. The legal developments that occurred under Danish rule revealed efforts to balance the requirements of foreign occupation with the practical necessities of governing complex societies, whose customary laws and social institutions had evolved over centuries of independent development. The accommodation between Danish legal traditions and English customary practices created hybrid systems that preserved essential elements of both cultures while establishing new precedents for the administration of justice. The diplomatic relationships that developed between Danish England and continental powers reflected the kingdom's integration into broader Scandinavian political networks, while maintaining connections to the European Christian community that had provided cultural and intellectual stimulus during the Saxon period. These relationships would prove crucial for subsequent political developments that would once again transform the character of English civilization. The death of Sweyn Forkbeard in 1014 created succession crises that revealed the fragility of the political settlement imposed through Danish conquest. The competing claims of Danish and English royal lines, complicated by the personal loyalties and political calculations of noble families who had accommodated themselves to foreign rule, produced conflicts that would reshape the political landscape of Northern Europe while determining the future character of English governmental institutions. The return of Ethilred from Norman exile represented an attempt to restore Saxon political authority that faced enormous challenges in reuniting a kingdom that had been fundamentally transformed by foreign occupation. The institutional damage caused by years of political disruption, the loyalty problems created by collaboration with Danish rulers, and the economic exhaustion resulting from sustained warfare all combined to create obstacles that would test the resilience of Saxon political traditions. The brief restoration of Saxon rule under Ethelred and his successors demonstrated both the enduring appeal of traditional English political institutions and their ultimate inadequacy when faced with the transformed conditions that now governed European political competition. The administrative capabilities that had once seemed adequate for governing a unified English kingdom proved insufficient for managing the complex problems created by decades of foreign occupation and internal division. The emergence of new political figures during this period of transition reflected the changed circumstances that now influenced English political development. Leaders like Edmund Ironside represented a generation that had come of age during the Danish occupation, their understanding of governance and warfare shaped by experiences that differed fundamentally from those of their predecessors. Their approaches to the challenges of royal authority reflected both continuity with Saxon traditions and adaptation to realities that those traditions had never anticipated. And so we reach the end of our long journey through the Saxon centuries, watching as the morning mist that once carried their longships to British shores now shrouds the final chapters of their extraordinary story. From those first Germanic warriors who crossed the North Sea seeking new lands and opportunities, we have witnessed the birth, flourishing, and ultimate transformation of a civilization that would lay the very foundations of England itself. The Saxon achievement was neither simple conquest nor cultural replacement, but rather the patient construction of a hybrid society that blended the best elements of Germanic tradition with Roman legacy, pagan wisdom with Christian faith, warrior culture with agricultural prosperity. Through centuries of adaptation and innovation, They create the institutions that would endure long after their political independence had ended, establishing legal traditions, linguistic patterns, and cultural values that continue to influence English-speaking peoples around the world. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let their story remind you that civilizations are not built through single decisive moments, but through the accumulated choices of countless individuals who face their own uncertainties with courage, wisdom, and hope for the future. The Saxon legacy lives on, woven into the very fabric of English identity, a testament to humanity's endless capacity for transformation, adaptation, and renewal.